لدينا بطل آخر هو دكتور بول تاكر، هو أخصائي لغوي وأيضاً أخصائي في تصميم وصناعة الامتحانات المقننة الدولية، وشغفه الآن هو صناعة الامتحانات المقننة باللغة العربية. سيحدثنا عن التقييم المبني على المعايير بشكل سريع.
What is the purpose of assessment? What do we want to do with assessment? And I would submit that the basic thing that we want to do with assessment is we want to answer a few fundamental questions. We need data. We need information that we can use to make important decisions. And this process of collecting data, it needs to be valid, it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be objective. So we know how to make and give tests, but we need quality assessment that is valid, reliable, and objective so that we can make data-driven decisions. Not just decisions based on the latest fad or what seems like a good thing to do right now or what everybody on staff votes and thinks, oh, we should all do this. No, we should all do that. We need data so that we can make data-driven decisions about curriculum, about methodology, and so that we can know what works and what doesn't work. Because this process that you're all going through right now and embracing this journey that you're embarking on and that Miriam has been talking about just now, this is a process that is in many ways experimental, right? There are going to be things that will be tried that won't work. Is that okay? Sure it is. But we need to know what works and what doesn't work. And we can't do that without reliable data. So, what questions do we want standards-based assessment to answer? And I want to make the point here briefly that not all assessment is standards-based, right? There are essentially two different types of assessment. You have norm-referenced assessment. Think of something like the TOEFL, which means you're just comparing an examinee with all the other examinees who are taking the test today. So norm-referenced assessment is quite useful, and it happens all the time. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about what's called Criterion-Referenced Assessment. There's a standard. There's something that you can hold performance up to. Think of like when you're building a building and you want to find out if your wall is straight or not. You all know what a plumb line is? It's simply a string with a weight at the end of it. You hold the plumb line up, and you can tell whether the wall is straight or crooked. That's the basic idea of a standard, and that's what we're doing with standards-based assessment. So we have certain questions that we want to answer. Now, there isn't just one kind of standards-based assessment. So, and different kinds of assessment answer different questions. So summative assessment, for instance, is going to answer the question, it's answering the question, did the learner meet the standard for advancement? Did the institution meet the standard for getting enough learners to the standard? But notice where it happens. It happens at the very end, right? So it's backwards looking. You go through the whole process, and at the end, you do your big summative assessment. Typically, that's handled by the Ministry of Education. That's there. It's always going to be there. Now, they're not typically standards-based at this point, or they're not based on the kind of standards we've been discussing up to this point. But you do need summative assessment. I want to talk more today about other kinds of assessment, because all assessment isn't summative. There's also interim assessment. Interim assessments answer a different question. The question they answer is, how are we doing so far? So along the path of these standards that you have, as you move along the path, occasionally you stop and you sort of take your pulse. You stop to see, how are we doing so far? Are we on track? Are we moving along at the right pace? Are we on the path and on the pace to meet our goals. Those goals that will be measured by that summative assessment at the end. Then there's another kind of assessment, formative assessment. Now, it's not uncommon to confuse interim assessment with formative assessment. Interim assessment can also be referred to as benchmark assessments. So it's not uncommon for people to assume that because you give assessments more frequently, that's formative. It's not formative assessment just because you give it more frequently. Interim assessments have their place. How are we doing? The common thing about interim assessments and summative assessments, it's how are we doing as an institution. Notice what happens when you go to formative assessment, though. The voice changes. It's no longer how are we doing as an institution, it's how am I doing as a learner. So formative assessment is first and foremost learner-centric. And it's about, and it's a process. So all along the way, we should be doing formative assessment. It's integrated into the instructional program. It's not set apart from the instructional program. You don't move through your instructional program and then stop, time for assessment, which is essentially what you do when you do summative or even interim or benchmark assessment. Formative assessment is integrated right into the instructional program. And the goal of formative assessment, it's answering a different question. What do I need to work on? How am I doing? How do I improve as a learner? Well, notice that change of voice, I. That means that we have to involve the learner in a way that we don't. The learner has to have a sense of ownership. So these standards that we've been hearing about aren't just for us as educators. They have to be embraced by, understood by, and owned by the learner as well. So that that learner says, these are my standards. This is the process I'm working through. This is how I know how I'm doing. Now, I need to, as a learner, it's one thing to know, have a sense of how I'm doing, and typically as learners, we kind of know where we are. I have a pretty good sense of what I can do in Arabic. It's not much, but I know what I can do. I also have a pretty good sense of all those things I can't do yet with Arabic. But what I need help with is this thing in the middle that Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. That's where formative assessment takes place. That's where real learning takes place. But as a learner, I need to understand where I'm going. I need to understand what the path is. I can't know where I am on the path if I have no sense of the path, which is why the standards can't be kept for us as educators. They have to be shared with the children, with the learners. They have to engage in those standards. They have to own those standards. They have to believe in those standards. They have to fully embrace them. Because if I don't know what the path is, how can I know where I am on that path? And if I don't know where I am on that path, I don't have any sense of owning my own progress. And that's what a learner really needs to do, is they need to be able to own their own progress. They need to be able to engage in that process. And they need to see it as a process. And we need to see it as a process. And one of the key elements in that process is meaningful feedback. So there has to be meaningful feedback. You don't just give a student a test and then say, okay, and your score was 72. Or your congratulations. Or your score was 53. Try harder next time. That's not enough. They need meaningful feedback that says, here's what you're doing well, and here's something to work on next. Let's work on this together. That's what formative assessment is about. That's what that zone of proximal development is about. That's where dynamic real learning takes place. So, how should standards-based assessment answer these questions? Well, it has to be evidence-based, okay? But evidence of what? And it needs to be task-based, but those tasks need to be meaningful and authentic. So when I was in high school, a teenage boy, I decided to join the tennis team. How many of you have ever played tennis? Okay, it's a fun sport. I haven't played in a long time, but I decided to join the tennis team. And so I had no idea how to play tennis. So I went out, and the coach immediately, the first thing is to start teaching me just the basics of tennis. And one of the basics of tennis is the serve. So the idea is to serve and get the ball in that little box on that rectangle on the other side of, importantly, on the other side of the net. Not the little rectangle on my side of the net, the little rectangle on the other side of the net. So one of the things, it turns out, I didn't know this, but it turns out that one of the things you have to do to be at all good at serving is the first thing is you have to learn the toss. So you have to toss that ball up, and when you toss it up, it needs to come down right there every time. And when I first started, I'd toss the ball up, and it would come down over here. And then I'd toss the ball up, and it would come down over here, and I was just chasing the ball all over the place. So he had me work on that. Practice that skill. It's an important skill. Toss the ball up and have it come down. And I got to the point, there's a little basket there, and I had a collection of balls, and I got to the point where I could toss that ball up and it would come down in the basket every time. So this is what I mean by that's evidence. When he comes back and sees that I can actually toss the ball up, not just that I claim that I can toss the ball up, which is what can-do statements are, by the way. Can-do statement is just a claim. It's I say I can do it. I have to show you that I can do it. I have to actually be able to toss that ball up and have it come down. So he comes back and he sees that I can do that, and that's wonderful. You can do that now. So that's evidence-based. But what is it evidence of? Is that evidence that I can serve well? Is it evidence that I can compete against an opponent who is evenly matched or who's the next level above me? No. It's evidence that I can toss a ball up and have it come down in a basket. So we have to think not just evidence-based, but evidence of what? And it has to be task-based, but the task has to be meaningful. I have to really be able to play that opponent and play well. And if not win, at least compete. And then if I don't win at the end, my coach comes and he says, hey, here's the things, and this is the formative part, right? The teaching part. Here are the things you did well. Here are the things you need to work on. And we're going to work together to where you finally can win against an opponent at that level. So that's what this whole process of assessment needs to be like. Assessment needs to be authentic. It needs to have real world value and benefit. Why? Real world, what you really would do in the real world. Why is that? Well, for one thing, if we're assessing skills that don't matter in the real world, what's the point? Or if we're just assessing the component skills. The other key component is motivation. Our learners need to be motivated to keep doing this. And the way you motivate someone is to engage them in real world tasks, not fake tasks. And that they have to believe you when you say, don't worry, someday this will come in helpful or valuable. No, you need to engage them, we need to engage them, and assessments need to engage them in real-world tasks. And finally, there's the concept of washback. Washback simply means that the test will influence the teaching, okay? So if we give tests that are not all of the things I've just talked about, if we just simply test whether or not I can throw the ball into the basket, that's all I'm ever going to practice is throwing the ball into the basket. If that's what you're going to test me on, that's what I'm going to learn. And that's what I'm going to practice, and that's what I'm going to get really good at. It's when I understand that you're going to test me on whether I can win the match. That's when I'm going to go beyond throwing the ball in the basket. That's when I'm going to focus as a learner on winning the match. So this idea of washback simply means that teachers will teach to the test. That's only a bad thing if it's a bad test. If it's a good test, that's all the things I've talked about, teaching to the test is not necessarily a bad thing. Thank you.